Chapter 4. The pueblo's name was Hawiku. The Spanish named it Cibola. It was a large complex that belonged to the Zuni people. They were good people, hard and stubborn in their nature, and they were one of the oldest closely knit tribes in the desert. And the Turk came to warn them of the Spanish arrival. It had been several years since the Turk visited the pueblo, but he had known the Zunis for a long time, and he was a very good friend of the chief and his son. However, when he entered the far side of the pueblo people welcomed the Turk with indifferent stares. Most of them had simply not remembered him. The Turk warned the Zuni priest and elder leaders and pointed to the gray sky, but the Zunis simply did not understand. After some time, the Zunis spoke with their shaman. When the shaman approached the Turk and listened to his story, he dismissed his claims. Angered by this, the Turk pointed again to the dark cloud over the horizon, but the shaman merely pointed back to the sun. Throughout the afternoon, the Turk spoke to every soul, but all seemed lost in translation, for the Turk's language was a heavy dialect, and much what he said went untranslated and misunderstood. The Turk then demanded the Zunis to meet with their chief. He asked several times, but the Zunis claimed the chief was not to be disturbed until sundown, so the Turk waited. He sat and looked at the pueblo. He stared at the 3-story houses and the red and brown clay complexes. Then he encircled its outside walls and its inner wooden palisade supports. On the roofs, a set of thick deer and buffalo skin had been thatched upon wooden beams and acted as canopies. Each house stood hard, tall, intact, fortified, and whole, with carved-out rectangular open spaces and a dozen ladders made of twine and sticks that scattered all throughout the 2nd and 3rd stories, and the Turk helped them throughout the afternoon. The Zunis seemed to appreciate the Turk's gesture, and as the heat of the day passed, the Zunis rested and prepared their night's meal, and the Turk sat on the ground with his eyes closed. At sundown, the chief finally arrived. At first, the chief acted extremely friendly to the Turk. He embraced him with open arms and smiled. The chief's son did the same, and they invited the Turk to their evening meal. They talked for an hour, but whenever the Turk mentioned the evil spirits that were soon to visit the pueblo, the chief said nothing. The evening meal was served, and they continued to talk. During the meal, the Turk seldom ate. He kept his eyes low and studied the flames of the fire. He cried many times and continued to plead with the chief, stating that if he and his people remained in the pueblo, they'd certainly die. He stated that these spirits were spirits of the damned. He pointed to the night sky. In the stars, a red glowing light shone a deep blood hue, and the Turk simply shook his head. But the chief simply smiled and stated that his people were ready for such a battle, and that indeed they had been waiting for one for quite some time. The Turk warned the chief one more time, but the chief simply patted the Turk on the shoulder, and the Turk looked at him with sad eyes and said not another word. Then the next day came. The Zunis grabbed their spears and gathered near the pueblo's entrance. Clouds blazed along and turned gray and black. And a mile away, the Turk stared at the pueblo, and he tried not to cry. Cibola. We finally reached it. The more I thought, the more it felt like Carimaka. Coronado ordered us to go forth. We rushed, and our horses crashed into each other. The other men raced on foot and caught up soon after. We stood still. We could have died, because what we saw was a mere pueblo. Rock and stone, wood and clay. We saw no gold. We saw no golden glow, no golden walls or turquoise-studded doors, or wise men to greet us. My men looked on in dismay, and the closer we got, the more horrible the reality. This was Gran Cibola, a poor pueblo in the sand. That's all it was. Cardenas's men cursed and shouted their insults. Even the scribes had yelled and hollered. It was all directed towards Marcos. What the hell is this? These are farms. We didn't leave Spain to conquer farms. Damn him. Damn that fucking priest to hell. These are the cities? Marcos, are these your cities? Marcos simply closed his eyes and quivered, and the cursing continued. Cardenas did not refrain, nor did he reprimand his men for their behavior. He just looked out and smeared the dust away from his face. My own men kept silent. Bernardo, the Diaz brothers, the blacksmiths, Julio, and all the others hid their quiet rage. I saw it fester, stir, and boil. Coronado came to the spot, and for the longest time, all he did was stare blankly at the pueblo. The other captains consulted him and offered their opinions, but most of them knew that Coronado would simply follow the protocol of assembly. He dismounted from his horse and walked in a long circle with his head hung down. Castañeda followed him. He asked for any order of any kind. Coronado simply shook his head and walked away. We stayed at attention. My men readied their swords, and I told them to relax until an order was given. Much more commotion broke out as the irritated men pointed and muttered. Then Coronado ordered the scribes to bring him the correct documents. When they returned, Coronado read them over in haste and handed the documents over to Castañeda, who then handed them to Cardenas. Coronado cleared his throat and stammered, trying to find the right words. Cardenas and I stood puzzled. Coronado stammered again. He gave out his orders in a brittle voice. His words rung incoherent and slurred. Cardenas, read them the decree. Sardina, take your men for reinforcement. Be as diplomatic as you possibly can be. For the rest of you, I order the rest to be on guard. As ordered, I assembled my men and joined Cardenas. There were 30 men in all. As morning crept to noon, we stayed and waited for the inevitable. Cardenas read the documents again, with his lips curled and his mouth open wide. I stood by him. He glared at me and then ordered me to leave him alone until he could recite the decree from memory. When he finished reading, I debated with him to move the men further to make our presence known. But Cardenas was like any man. He was defensive and self-righteous. He was completely assured and unreasonable. I'm in command here, not you, Cardenas said. Get that through your head. I'm only suggesting, sir, I said. Your suggestion is void, Cardenas shouted. We were told to be diplomatic. I'm not moving a goddamn inch. Assemble the archers. Understood? For half an hour, we stayed in place and watched the pueblo. More and more townspeople emerged into sight and took guarded positions along the walls. At that time, Cardenas refused to send any scouts over and waited for the translators to arrive. When they did, Cardenas ordered them to march forward. We staggered and got up to 50 feet from the walls. Cardenas gave another signal. We drew forward another 25 feet. Then we halted. Cardenas ordered a double phalanx formation. 6 archers were split in half, with 3 on the far right side and the other 3 dressed to the left. Cardenas aligned himself to the center and remained on his horse. From there, we got a closer look at both the pueblo and its people. I saw women cradle their children into their arms. The men guarded the walls, carrying spears and clubs. Most of them wore nothing but sheets of wool. Their eyes seemed ancient and stern, and they hardly moved. The translators gave the sign, and Cardenas approached about 20 paces, with the decree in his hands. Then he ordered the entire unit to follow. We followed 10 paces. At first, Cardenas performed the declaration and read the article in a clear, monotone voice. The translator spoke, though the people could not hear him. Cardenas repeated. He read the decree again aloud in a long, over-enunciated and preposterous tone, and his Castilian tongue never sounded more arrogant. All were left in terrible confusion, but Cardenas went on. My name is Garcia Lopez de Cardenas. We are ordered by the King of Spain, King Charles V, and His Holy Pope Paul III. We come from Holy Spain. The translators raised their hands to the sky. They touched and rubbed their shoulders and stomachs. They proceeded to point to the sky and the ground. Then they struck their fist against their chest and grunted loud and forcefully. But in truth, much of it did not matter. I found out later that much of what Cardenas said, the translators simply did not understand. The translators improvised the best they could, and the Pueblo people remained confused. But Cardenas went on. We understand this place is called Cibola. We think highly of your city and come as your humble and inspired guest. Great Cibolians, we take you with great honor. The translators made gestures with their arms and fists. The Cibolan faces lit up in rage. Cardenas, startled by their reaction, cursed at the translators, while at the same time tried his best to look dignified and peaceful. It proved to be quite a juggling act, and it certainly appeared Cardenas needed more practice. A whole minute of confusion was followed by another. The Cibolans garnered their rage even louder than before. They kept still and locked into their position, and I could feel the whole Pueblo erupt in anger. A tall and lean Cibolan walked towards the scribes. 2 other Cibolans followed him. In their hands, they carried 3 bushels of corn. I ordered Julio to retrieve the gifts in kind. The men rushed to the bushels of corn and ate like starved pigs. But Cardenas yelled at them and ordered them back to their positions. Then Cardenas improvised and quickly ordered the men to find something of value and bring it forward. They scrambled in haste. I ordered my men to search through the caravan. About 2 minutes later, I shouted at them to stop and return. But to my dismay, all the men found were a few wolfskins and deer hides. Cardenas ordered them to be brought forward. He looked at the skins with some reservation, and the translation continued. The slaves walked up and handed the hides over to one of the Cibolans, and Cardenas went on. We too show you gifts of gratitude, and we will show you love and solidarity as long as we remain your humble friends. Then Cardenas nodded. He nodded because he knew what the rest of the decree entailed, the unyielding truth of true conquest and absolute justified dominion. He went on. If, however, you cross our trust and you do not accept our friendship, if you do not comply and surrender your idiotic religion, we will be forced to kill you all. I looked to the translators on the Cibolan side. They neither moved nor spoke a single word. We will burn your village. We will enslave you and take all your women for ourselves. We will... The translation stopped. Cardenas folded the scroll back in place. Then he turned to me and whispered, Do you think they understand? I didn't answer. The Cibolans stood quietly. Some of them yawned. Others spat to the ground and looked away. Cardenas turned to the translators. Do they all understand? They stood silent. They neither confirmed nor denied. Then the chief of the Pueblo came into view. He was a large man with a round stomach. His son stood close to his side, and as they walked towards the entrance of the walls with hides that we had brought them, they walked further and stopped. Then the chief spoke out, and the translators and scribes turned back to Cardenas. They say they know who we are, said one translator. Then the chief took a wolf skin, tossed it to the ground, and walked away. At that point, I thought for sure Cardenas would order an attack, but when I looked at him, he smiled and shook his head. Now's not the time. Withdraw your men, Sardina. I let out a sigh. Then I gave my men the signal. We retreated back east to camp. I heard our metal clang off in succession. We moved at an awkward pace. I turned back and heard the Pueblo cheer and shriek. It was a jovial sound of laughter, and it was obvious that they were mocking us. I kept my horse steady and looked to my men. The sudden withdrawal caught them by surprise, and they turned their heads back many times. I assured them that this withdrawal was temporary, but I was soon running out of excuses and rationalizations, and rather than quarrel with Cardenas, I kept quiet and drove my horse harder through the bush. As we reached camp, I saw men gather sticks for the night's fire. At the time, only half of the men were there. The other men arrived towards dusk. Tovar's men joined my men soon after. Over towards the edge of the camp, Coronado and Castaneda sat on their horses and peered over to the Pueblo. Coronado then sent half a dozen scouts and scribes back to the Pueblo. An hour went by, then another. There were no reports of any kind. I walked around the fires. The men whispered and shouted. "They're not back? They must have seen something. Cardenas said there were only walls." "Only walls? What kind of city only has walls?" "They must know how to guard their gold." "Marcos didn't get this far. He couldn't have." "Why are we waiting? What's the point?" "Coronado's a fool. We should be there by now. Where are these damn scouts?" I joined Tovar at his fire. Our words were few. "Whether we find gold or not, Marcos is certainly a special man," said Tovar. "Why? What makes him so special?" I asked. "Only a truly insane man would travel this far. Marcos did it twice. Any man with any intelligence would have deserted this place a long time ago." "He's a monk for a reason," I said. "Marcos is a good monk," said Tovar. "I will not argue that fact. He stays with his insanity, and we've been following it for a long time." I returned to my men. I felt the tension radiating from their foreheads. They growled and shouted at each other, but the only man to speak to me directly was Bernardo. There was much fear in his face, and he stammered like a frightened child. "Captain Sardina?" "Yes, Bernardo." "May I have a word?" "Yes." I'm vexed, Captain. My mind races. I can't stop. I just have so many questions." "What are they, Bernardo?" "Why did Cardenas retreat? We could have taken them. We could have taken them all." "It was his decision." "Yes, but it was a terrible one. Why did he hesitate? We read them the decree. They accepted the terms. Did they not? And we turn our backs?" "Too many questions, Bernardo." I apologize, Captain Sardina, but I have to ask them. This is too upsetting. We've come too far." "Yes, we have." "What is this Cibola? Why is it so small?" "Carimaca was small." "Was it smaller than what we saw today?" "No, but you must remember." A howl of a wolf broke my concentration. It came clear and loud. I looked all about the sky and waited for another howl. Another cry in the darkness, but all fell back to silence. Then I ended the conversation. "Tend to your wife, Bernardo," I said. "Why?" "Just go." "Yes, Captain." I stared and watched the stars gather in the sky. And all that time, all I thought about was Peru and Carimaca. I thought about that night, the night we waited in the square. The night Atahualpa tested our patience. How we fretted and feared. How we could only think about what we would do in the morning. This night felt very much the same. But Coronado wasn't Pizarro. I knew that from the very second I saw him. This time it would be different. Though I still did not know Coronado's endgame. I doubt if he knew either. And with that hellish thought embedded in my mind, I started to think of all the things I simply did not know. I didn't know if Marcos was telling the truth. I didn't know whether we would find gold. I didn't even know what month it was. But the only thing I knew for certain was that there was going to be a battle in the morning. I sat for another hour as thought after thought teemed inside my mind. Then I got up again and encircled the camp. I noticed a distinctive hum. At first, it sounded like a swarm of bees. Then it came in and pulsed and slushed like the waves of the ocean. Then I heard the screams. And a slew of spears flew above my head. The natives shrieked and hollered with high-pitched squeals. Some of them flew themselves up towards the air, and as they fell to the ground, we promptly slashed them and hacked at their limbs. The rest threw stones and fought with clubs. The archers mounted their crossbows and fired. The natives ran and fled back to the bush and disappeared through the night. Ahead, I saw a horse stumble with a spear lodged in its neck. A minute later, the horse collapsed and died. The ambush had ceased moments later. We stayed on guard for the remaining time. No one slept. No one could. And when dawn broke, I knew exactly what would happen. The next day, Coronado assembled his captains. And once the captains received their specific orders, they led their men down the hill. The march lasted a mile. A surging wind rolled in, and the sun died in the clouds. The cavalry led and struck their colors. They drew their flags and sounded their drums and trumpets in formal procession. Then they headed east and marched their way to the pueblo. At the head of the line were the priests and the scribes. Marcos and Brother Luis stood at the very helm of the line. They swung lanterns of incense to and fro, and the smoke tumbled in thick streams of black and gray. Behind them stood the infantry. The men were both young and middle age. Tovar's men and Cardenas's men held the right flank, while Juan Saldivar and Biernuevo's men held the left flank. The men of Diego Lopez, Melgoza, Bolivar, and Sardina guarded the center. The cavalry and artillery cannons were positioned on either side of the mainland and dressed accordingly. And at the very end of the line was Coronado, sitting firmly on his white Arabian stallion. The drums blared on loudly. From outside the pueblo, the Cibolans guarded the walls once more. Then the chief walked to the throngs of men and handed them each a stone. He looked at each of the men with solemn pride. The ground shook as the horses raced over. The children of the pueblo screamed. Then the drums stopped. The two armies stood 100 yards away from each other. The Cibolas stared at the Spanish long and hard. The Spanish did the same. The high priest and the pueblo chief gathered and approached the entrance. Both held a handful of powdered white cornmeal in their hands. They approached and dropped the powder to the ground, forming a heavy, thick white line. Then the chief stood behind the line and glared at the Spanish with his arms folded. He yelled out a scream, and a trail of white dust simmered and dissipated in the air. Then Brother Luis walked forward with two translators at his side. In his hands, Luis held a crumpled-up scroll. It was the same scroll Cardenas had read from the previous day, and as Luis walked towards the white line, he crossed himself and blessed all that was around and behind him. But before Luis addressed the Cibolans, he took one last look at Marcos and watched him cringe and cry. Then he turned his back and read aloud from the scroll. He spoke calmly and slowly. "We come from Holy Spain. By orders from King Charles V and His Holy Pope Paul III, we claim this city to be under his rule." The Cibolans gawked and growled. Luis continued. "And by divine providence, we will teach." 3 Cibolans rushed up to the line and stood by the chief. They waved their spears and clubs, daring the Spanish to draw forward. "We will teach." The Cibolan bowmen took their positions outside the perimeter and aimed straight at Luis. The Spanish quietly countered and drew 3 horsemen to encircle and protect Luis. The Cibolans shouted more. Coronado then made his way forward and stood 5 feet behind Luis and the horsemen. Coronado then placed a blanket of wool into each translator's hand. He nodded, and Luis continued. "We come from Holy Spain. We wish to make peace with you all. We will send you gifts to show our friendship." The translators took the wool and placed them before the line. They knelt down and bowed, But once the words were uttered, one of the Cibolan bowmen launched an arrow and struck one of the translators in the back. The translator fell and bled on the sand. For a long second, Coronado kept still. Then the second passed. He signaled and shouted out a phrase that his men wanted to hear their entire lives. He shouted it 3 times, each time louder than the last. Then Coronado made a sign of the cross, unleashed his sword, and led the charge on towards the pueblo. Santiago! The Spanish charged into the center of the pueblo, and a mass of chaos erupted from end to end. At the entrance, the Cibola warriors rushed and plowed into the Spanish, attacking them with their spears and clubs. The Pueblo warriors struck at oblique angles, and for a while, they surrounded the Spanish. The warriors swung and strangled and bit and clawed. The Cibola bowmen fired arrow after arrow, and when they ran out, they tossed their bows aside and joined the attack. But the warriors soon realized that the Spanish armor was far too strong and impenetrable, and each thrust they threw bounced off the metal in dull sounds of clinks and pangs. The blast pounded and pulverized the ground. They sparked and flashed and shook the earth. The shells smashed through wooden palisades, and the shards of 1,000,000 splinters showered down like rain. Soon, clouds of smoke emerged, and the pueblo's fortified walls quickly crumbled to pieces. The Spanish horses galloped and paced. They drove and trampled and stomped the warriors to the ground. But as more shells exploded, the smoke blinded the entire land. After the blast, the warriors dispelled their charge and ran in retreat. Then the Spanish sought ground and cut their way through, plunging their swords into the warriors. And they did so with gleeful eyes. They sliced off limbs and hacked off heads, and a steady stream of blood floated in the air and landed on the ground, forming spews and puddles. In less than a half hour, the entire population of the pueblo was severed in half. The ground was covered in hands, feet, and decapitated heads. But the Spanish were not satisfied. They took to the ladders and chased the Indians through the second and third tiers of the pueblo. The warriors shot arrows and launched stones and rocks, trying to thwart the Spanish from approaching closer, but the Spanish only gained more confidence. The captains ordered the archers forward. They followed the warriors up through the second level of the pueblo and picked them off in succession, while the musketeers fired their charges along the ladders and entryways. Coronado ordered his men to climb the ladders. He pushed and shoved and jabbed his sword through the smoke, and in a long, slow second, he looked all about and sensed the surrounding chaos. He watched the Cibolan spear one of the horses beneath its white stomach, and seconds later, he watched the same Cibolan get decapitated. Then he watched his men grab 2 of the Indians by their hair, and after the initial struggle, the men took the Indians further down and crushed their heads along the hard edges of the walls. Coronado came to a ladder and started to climb, and from there he pointed onward with his blood-stained sword, and he called his men for another charge. He climbed the steps in a quick, rapid rhythm, skipping most steps, with his eyes fixed to the very top rung. His men followed. He climbed halfway to the top, but before Coronado reached the top, 5 warriors gathered at the base of the ladder and swayed it back and forth. One warrior grabbed hold of Coronado's boot, and Coronado swung his sword and slashed the warrior across his face. He yelled once more for his men, but as Coronado reached the top step, a flying rock struck him square in the head. He stumbled, and the ladder gave way. Then he fell 15 feet straight down and landed on his back. A dozen warriors screamed to him and pelted him with stones, but Cardenas and Castaneda immediately laid on top of them and acted as human shields, and protected their superior until the very last rock was thrown. When the Spanish saw what happened to Coronado, they regrouped and attacked again. Tovar led the charge up the platform. He looked across and up above. He ignited a torch and gathered the remaining men up the platform. Then he screamed out his orders. "Torch them! Torch them all!" The archers dipped their arrows in flames and fired away at the upper dwellings and to the piles of hay below. And once again, smoke rose up to the top of the pueblo, and the cannons fired more rounds. But then, all had stopped. More minutes passed. In the silence, all that was heard were grunts and aches. By a tiny crevice, 30 warriors crouched and waited. Some of the Spanish spotted them and fired, but the warriors managed to disappear into the smoke. The Spanish waited. They stood in soot and smoke. They looked at each other and back to the walls. Then a native dashed through a passway, and through the smoke, one of the warriors yelled out a battle cry. Then 24 more warriors ran through the smoke and screamed, with spears in their hands. We killed all that was in sight. We did many times over. The fog dipped. The smoke swirled, but I could still see my men's faces. Their sweaty, dirty faces were smeared with sweat and blood. They possessed the same demonic spirit of years past, and I saw it in all of them. I saw it in the way they jammed and pounded and thrusted their swords through the heaps of Indian flesh. And I knew I had possessed the same undeniable feeling they had. It looked like they were starving. They were starving for blood and vengeance. They embraced the terror before them. They felt all too justified. After we climbed the ladders to the second platform, we ran after the Cebolas and saw them hide off into the houses along the crevices of the walls. Then a blur of movement passed me. I saw 6 of the men chase the warriors across the perimeter. I saw the men laugh and tear away at the warriors' intestines, holding them in their hands for all to see. Oddly, Bernardo was one of these men. He appeared through the fog. He cursed and mimicked the other men and their movements, trying to fall into their rhythm. Every movement he made seemed false. His face beamed with delight, but he looked awkward and deathly afraid. I kept a close eye on him, and he disappeared through the shadows. The cannons returned and fired. Their shells pierced and exploded over our heads, and once again the ground shook. An endless cloud of dirt and dust and black and gray smoke covered the entire pueblo. I looked at the surviving pueblo men and women as they ran in pain. I watched the men and children flee towards the outside. Some of them had jumped off 3 stories and landed and screamed through the fog. And as I turned, I saw about 20 warriors rush from the corner of the houses some 50 feet away and watch their last charge. They bolted and crashed into a pile of our men and surprised them from behind. They threw spears and struck 2 of our men, and they dashed their way down, all the way down to the other side of the pueblo. But by then, they had been cornered off. They ran in between the open doors. The smoke of the cannon fire hovered, and it made it impossible to see. But we heard them race from door to door. Again, the heavy artillery fired, and shells blasted above our heads. They were called off a minute later. Through the smoke, I saw a warrior run off through the distance. Then I heard another. 5 more warriors ran into the open, and the bowmen picked them off one by one. We looked all through the houses and the storage doors of the 2nd and 3rd layer, but we hadn't found a soul. They either retreated or died. Then a terrible silence followed, and we came to a reality. For some, it came as a relief. For others, it was hard to take. There was nothing left to kill. The battle was over. Another massacre. To me, it seemed common. Body after body was bloodied from head to foot. Body after body slammed down to the dust. And again I heard the ungodly, wretched cries of the women. But I remained in trance. A minute later, a little Cebolian boy had given me an odd stare. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and I'll never forget the look he gave me. It was simple, but it said everything. His look was sad, piercing, and all too true. But even in that instance, I did not understand, for I truly did not realize what I had become. I climbed down to the first platform and made my way back through the entrance. At the center, I noticed that the fortified red wall had crumbled to a quarter of its size. The whole of the ground was covered with blood and corpses. From the corner of my eyes, I peered and saw two of the slaves push a burning carriage with fresh bodies already stacked upon it. But as I stepped beside the carriage, I saw a lump of armor lay on the ground. I rushed towards the body and heard the women cry and gather. Then I looked at its face. An arrow had lodged into Bernardo's eye, and his entire face had been stained with blood. The tip of the arrow emerged from the other side of his head, and the blood oozed and poured out. His face was pale and felt like cold rubber. He had one eye open. His other eye was completely shut. But still, the blood gushed over and covered my hands and armor. I held his hand. I checked 3 times. Somehow he still held a pulse. I crossed myself and tried to pray, but no words came to me. And through the smoke, I waited and clutched onto Bernardo's hand, and as the rest of my men gathered and watched, I felt his hand start to slip and give way. We turned him to his side, and the blood fell down his forehead. And a minute later, Bernardo died in my arms. The smoke lingered. I went up to Archanga and embraced her. She looked into my eyes. Then she screamed. She screamed so loud and hard that I shuddered, and with all her might she pushed me away and disappeared through the ash. The men took her husband's corpse over to the end of the camp, and the priest and Brother Luis gathered and blessed it. The dogs barked and choked in the dust. With Coronado injured, Cardenas ordered the men to search the pueblo. This god-awful city, as Marco had claimed, was finally ours to take. So we did. For the remainder of the day, we searched the entire pueblo. Gold was on our minds, and nothing else. And our entire lives depended on what we would find. We searched through and rushed. We searched through windows. We searched through the straw. We searched through the piles of maize. We searched the outside perimeter. We searched the inside. We searched through the hot ash and soot, and we ran into each other. We prayed no prayers. We said no words. There was gold, the want, and nothing else. All the men wanted was to hold it in their hands so the whole world would know, just as I did, so long ago. But we found no gold. We didn't find an ounce. We uncorked every lid. We slashed basket after basket. We only found beans and corn. We searched harder. We reached the top of the pueblo and found more burnt bodies. And before we made it back down, some of the men vomited from the smell. From there, we found several pots, but every one was empty. We found nothing. No gold. None whatsoever. And after another hour of searching, the men came back to the entrance. Their faces grew pale and listless. It was as if their souls were taken from them. But as the silence took over, I saw the rage begin to build, and I watched it grow to a boil. One man took a corpse by its head and screamed into its mouth. "Where did you hide it? Where?" Other men did the same. They screamed and shrieked and repeated. The rage dictated the rest of the day, and Marcos became its prime center. Marcos scrambled and looked for a place to hide. There wasn't any. He looked lost and deranged. He looked small and frightened. Brother Luis prayed for forgiveness, yet he prayed alone. The crowd gathered. In seconds, they surrounded Marcos. They swung their swords and screamed for his execution. "You're a fraud, Marcos! You're a fraud of a friar! You goddamn son of a bitch! This is what you saw? Clay and dirt? Clay and fucking dirt! Did they tell you to lie in the seminary? What else did they teach you?" Shouts exploded. Cannons fired. and the men raced and chased Marcos throughout the pueblo. They grabbed hold of his robe and tore it from the seams, but somehow Marcos wiggled his way to safety and ran to a higher ground. And again, the men chased after him. "Kill that bastard! Kill that fucking priest! Cut that bastard open! Quarter him! Quarter him limb by limb! You're gonna die, you little man! Yes, you are! Hang him! Hang him now! Fraud! Fraud!" Upon the second level of the pueblo, Marcos found a tiny crevice and hid inside of it. He waited and prayed. Minutes later, the crowd found him, and again, Marcos ran. Stones pelted his entire body, and Marcos fell to his knees. His face was smeared with blood and dirt. The crowd captured Marcos and ushered him to Coronado's tent. Tovar then ordered all the captains to gain control of the men and cease the riot. But all knew that it was ultimately Coronado's decision. And being that he was injured and unresponsive, they knew they had to wait. Marcos was chained and held under arrest, but it did not matter. It wasn't enough. The crowd wanted blood. They wanted his head on a plate. They shouted more insults at him. They yelled the chant of fraud over and over again, and nothing on earth could keep the men from swearing. But Coronado lay asleep. His head was wrapped in bandages. He could barely move a finger. The captains all consulted him and stated the obvious, but Coronado remained unresponsive. Then Castaneda approached and spoke to him in Latin, and as he did, we were stunned to see Coronado finally open his eyes. He arched his back and sat up and stared. His servants brought him wine. We all gathered around him, like Christ at the Last Supper, and we waited for our orders. "Sir, this is your decision," said Castaneda. "What shall we do with Marcos?" Then Coronado whispered into Castaneda's ear. "He needs another hour," said Castaneda. The words were slurred and understood, so we left the tent and waited. I was in between the crowd and the captains. I looked for Tovar and saw him smoke and share a pipe with one of the Indian allies. I gave him a look, but it was not returned. I returned to the crowd. They were exhausted. Their voices had cracked. Their sad faces were stamped with a permanent cringe of despair. And as they stared, they seemed to be in search of another grand mantra to cling to. "Hang him! Hang him now!" seemed the best they could offer. I came near Cardenas and Castaneda. They were so engrossed in their conversation that they didn't notice me. They wanted Marcos dead. They spoke of no alternative. A cock crowed, and the hour was over. I found Coronado alone and saw him walk in circles about the sands. He babbled to himself, and I saw him reach his hand to block out the sun. But then he turned, and as he caught my eye, he glared and staggered back to the pueblo. He raised his sword, and as we watched him, a scream rang out, and once again the mob formed and gathered around the tent. The guards brought Marcos forward, and all watched as Coronado slowly walked over. The guards carried a wooden stump and stood it upright. Then they took Marcos and laid his head upon the stump. The crowd gathered and cheered and salivated, and Coronado approached with a bloody sword in his hand. He gestured to the crowd. He approached the stump, bent over, and tousled Marcos's gray and ragged hair. Marcos recited and rushed his prayers and cried. The men screamed again and again. Then Coronado raised his sword and held it above his head. He lowered the sword and stared. Then he raised the sword above his ear, but before he drove it down, he stopped. Then he threw the sword to the ground, and the crowd fell silent. Coronado shouted back, "We are better than this!" He repeated the words, but the crowd remained shocked. Then Coronado looked down. "Get up, Marcos," he said. Marcos groveled at Coronado's waist. but Coronado merely pointed back west, in the direction of the fading sun. "Leave, Fray Marcos. Leave now." Then Coronado slowly turned his back and returned to his tent. The captains followed, but I stayed. I watched Marcos disappear back into the desert, with his head hung down, still shocked that he was alive. The crowd continued to curse at him, but their roars had dissipated. I watched Marcos for the longest time as he exited the pueblo. I continued to stare back into the desert, and I heard Marcos sob. He sounded like a widow. He might as well have been dead. It would have been easier for him. I watched his body get smaller and smaller as he walked away, and after another minute, I had lost sight of him forever. For 2 days, Marcos trekked alone, and for 3 more months, he remained in the desert. In the back of his mind, he thought of his final days on Earth. Even if he survived to reach back to Compostela, he knew he would live his entire life in shame. But somehow, he accepted the terms. He felt pain all throughout his body. He groveled and tried to reach for something. He cried and trembled, though there was nothing there. There was nothing but sand. And as the days passed, Marcos fell into his horrible dreams. At night, many demons arose from the ground and haunted him. They came to him in voices, and also in the flesh. And at noon of each day, he met with the Antichrist and did battle. He screamed and shrieked and sulked in sorrow. And as the Turk looked back from the valley beyond, he saw Marcos continue to wage his daily holy war for his soul. He stared and studied him, but he neither grinned nor laughed. Instead, he looked back at the pueblo, and the Turk glared at the other devils of the desert, the ones who still remained.